Doctors and Coaches Corner. I'm the doctor and Brett's the coach. You want to wave to him, Brett? So we'll do that waving. We're glad that you're here. Um, we're going to be talking about conflict today. And conflict is a fact of life. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I can be in conflict with me, right? I have two different mindsets. I'm thinking, well, no, and right. And so conflict happens to all of us. And helping young people learn how to resolve that on their own and come to a conclusion to do it respectfully is incredibly important because you know what? You and I as adults don't have people keeping us from the conflict. And so we have to know how to resolve it and we have to know how to end it up. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And if you have questions, please include them into the chat and Robert will convey them to us. Robert's the person you can't see behind the screen. That is actually running this and making it work. He's the one, if it doesn't work, we blame him. So anyhow, Brett, would you like to say something to these folks?
Not in particular.
Not in particular?
I'm antisocial tonight.
You're antisocial. Well, I think that that's probably what you're needing is some sleep. What do you think?
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right? So when you burn the candle at both ends, we all end up in a bind. So let's
both ends and the middle.
Yes, both ends and the middle. It meets in the middle, right? And that's where the conflict happens. So, Robert, let's get started. What's one of the questions that we might want to talk about tonight?
Yes. So the first question is going to be, why is conflict resolution an important skill for youth?
Ooh. So, one of the things that we do when we work with young people is we try and give them academic skills for sure. That's why they go to school. But beyond that, we have to have life skills. And the ability to resolve conflict is a life skill because throughout your life, you're going to experience conflict. And if you don't know if you can't recognize that it's conflict to begin with, that's going to be a problem. So you certainly can't solve it. And then once you've identified, oh, whoa, there's a conflict here and what's really going on and trying to take a look at that, what you have to realize is that you can't change the other person, but you can tell them how you are feeling, not blaming them, but to say, I'm feeling this way. And then you can invite them to talk to you about how they're feeling. And you may discover that what you thought was just going just hunky-dory is not going for them at all. They're interpreting it in a totally bad way and vice versa. And so that's why we have to learn how to resolve it so that we don't both continue down this road at loggerheads with each other so that we can go, okay, this is what happened. This is how I feel about it. How do you feel about it? Can we find common ground to move forward? So I think that it's because it's a life skill and it's one that they will need to employ often. So that's my 2 cents on why it's important. So I'll bump it to you, Brett.
Yeah, I mean, I would just ask the question: has anybody experienced conflict in their life? And it doesn't matter basically what age you are. The answer is yes. So, is it important for youth? Yeah, because we know there's a lot of adults that still can't get it right, and it's probably because they didn't practice it, like when they were youth and whatnot. And people that tell me, yeah, I don't experience any conflict. I said, well, obviously you haven't driven the LA highways before, right? Whether it's the 5 or 210 or any of that kind of stuff, or with your own kids, it could be any youth across the board that they're going to experience conflict. And then the last thing I'll say is my personal kids used to come home from like middle school, and they're like, man, my second grade teacher's a jerk. And I said, good. And they go, what do you mean good? And I go, well, do you think there's going to be jerks in your life? And you're going to have to learn how to deal with them? Do you think there's going to be conflict in your life? Do you think you're going to have to learn how to deal with it from, all different angles, different personality types, and so on and so forth? And so, they were trying to tattle on the teacher. And I'm like, no, that's good. We need to all learn how to deal with conflict in a productive way.
Absolutely. And I think that when people say, oh, no, I don't have conflict, I always worry that at some point there's going to be a Mount Vesuvius eruption, right? Because we experience conflict and it doesn't feel good and we don't like it. But if you keep tamping it down so that you don't acknowledge that you are not always in agreement with other people, that's a problem. And it will erupt at some point when maybe when you most need to be calm, right? When things are so tense and maybe life threatening and you haven't acknowledged conflict, that could explode on you and that could end up being a really not good thing for you. So it's a life skill for sure.
Amen, sister.
Amen. Robert, what's next?
Yes. Next question is, how can I teach youth to communicate effectively during conflicts?
So you want to start with that, Brett? Because I know you've helped kids work through.
Well, yeah, and you and I've taken a lot of training. I feel like to be a good teacher or a great teacher, you have to be a great learner as well. And I think I always get them confused, Stephen Glenn and Covey, but I think this was Covey that said, seek first to understand and then to be understood. And it's always funny to me when I'm watching, this conflict arising and the person just jumping on, getting ready. And it's like, dude, relax, listen first. They're trying to formulate their response already, and they're not listening to what the person's saying. So if you can't listen, then you don't have a starting point. And if you don't have a starting point, it's like being in that mall and you go to the kiosk and it says you are here, but there is no you are here. There is no red dot, so to speak. So I think that that's the first thing. I think the second part of that is practicing active listening, right? And so where you're shaking your head or or oh that makes sense, or these different things. It's best to do that non-verbally because you don't want to interrupt them. But you can shake your head, you can turn your head. I know, like sometimes I'll when I'm just bored out of my gourd, so to speak, I'll watch some of the YouTube shorts and some of the reaction videos. They're turning their head and they're smiling like, oh, that's good. And I remember, now I do that even more so and when I'm doing trainings because it really helps with practicing that, active listening. And the last thing I would say is, when you talk about conflict, I always say, is it personal or is it personality? Right? Because we've all walked into a room before and we do this where we call it four corners. And you're just like, there's something about that person over there that I don't think I'm going to like. Well, probably because they're so close to who you are. Right? And then you walk into another party and you're like, man, I really like that person. Right? So a lot of times it's not personal and that's how we take it. It's just personality.
I would agree with that. Another thing that I think is really important is that people learn to speak in I messages. So when things happen and you're in conflict, you have choices about how you're going to react to that conflict. You can be upset, you can be ranting and raving, you want to blame the other. You have all kinds of things that you can do. But if you can take a step back and say, okay, how am I feeling about this? And what triggered that? So one of the things I like to do with iMessage is to say, when I saw, when I heard, when I noticed, when I felt, because sometimes it's just a feeling that you have. There's no words or anything that have been said. You're interpreting people's body language and all of that, and there's going to be conflict there. So when you start that iMessage and you say, when I notice, and then you name what you noticed, I feel. I feel left out. I feel ignored. I feel disappointed. What am I feeling? So when I notice this, I feel this. And then what happens with all of us when we feel something is that we bring that feeling up into our head and we start thinking about it and we put words around that. So the I conversation would go, When I notice or when I hear, whatever that word is, when I notice that you're not talking to me, I feel left out and I feel disappointed. And I think you don't like me anymore. And that's your chain. And if you stop there, you will be acting as if they don't like you. And well, I'll show you, you don't have to like, right? That becomes very personal. Like Brett said, it becomes personal, not personality. So the final step in that is to say, will you talk to me about how, what you notice, what you feel, what you think? Because if we can get to that level, we will be able to find a path out. We'll be able to find common ground. But if I say to you, you did this and you did that, and you didn't do this and you didn't do that, you're going to be defensive because it feels like an attack to you, whether it's an attack or not. But if I say, I'm feeling this way, let's talk about that. That's different. So I think that iMessages, you can do that on a peace walk with kids. You can teach them how to do that. And they two of them walk down and the first person gets to say their part, the second person. So there are lots of strategies that you can use. But I think that it's, I certainly agree with listening first if you possibly can, unless you need to express how you feel. But this is what I notice. This is what I feel. This is what I think. So I think that's a good way to help kids address how they're feeling during conflict.
And my favorite is when either adults or kids, go to a training about iMessages, and then they say, well, the way I felt or I thought or I whatever, and they go, and then you made me.
Yeah.
And they start throwing the U words out. So I felt terrible because you made me feel terrible.
Right. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know about you, but a situation can happen. And if I'm having a really good day and things are going my way, I'm not upset by that in the least. It's this situation. If, like today, I had not the world's greatest day because they are trimming the trees in my neighborhood and you can't drive in it because the trucks are there, I could go into, well, it's all your fault. But the fact of the matter is, I can either choose to go, they're just trimming the trees, which I did not choose to do, by the way. I got upset by it, right? And it was a conflict and it was this, but no, I made that choice. I could have said, yeah, no big deal. I'll just go around. Or I can make it be a big deal and be upset and mad and blaming them. And so I had expressed earlier before we started this, that I'm going to have my moment of it's all their fault, but I have to come back and realize that it's my choice about how I feel. Not your choice.
I like the way you said that earlier too in the introduction. What about the internal conflict? Because that's where you were at. You were like, okay, what I want to do is tell them to, go off somewhere, not on my street, please. And so now you have that internal conflict. And so a lot of time when we think of conflict resolution, we always think it's with two or more people, but we have this internal conflict, like you said earlier. I thought that was a good point.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. All right, Robert, let's move on.
Yes, our next question is, what are the basic steps for resolving conflicts among peers?
So, there is a solution fluency model. And I'll just briefly describe it. But what it is a step-by-step path you can take so that you can find a solution. So it's not just about conflict. It's about how can you find solution. Maybe you're just disappointed in the way you did something and you'd like to do it differently. But it's a step-by-step process that you can go through. And I think that it helps to do that with conflict as well. So step number one is to determine what is it that you're really talking about here? What is the conflict? What is the actual conflict? Not your emotions about it, but just what is it? Because too often when we don't identify what's really going on, we solve for the totally wrong problem, right? It's like giving you a prescription for glasses before we've even checked your eyes, right? We just assume we know. So that step one in finding solution with conflict or anything else is to identify what's the challenge here, what's going on. Then the next step, after you've identified that, is to ask yourself, what have other people done around this? Have there been other solutions? Have other people tried different things? What might I need to know before I can head into this? Right? So that you're really trying to get grounded in the situation. And then you can brainstorm. And if you're brainstorming by yourself, that's not nearly as fun as brainstorming with someone else. But you can brainstorm and ask yourself, so what are all the possibilities of things that I could do? So today with the trees, I could have stopped my car and said, look, get out of the way. That was a possibility. I could have done nothing. I could have called the people who employed them. I could have called right? I had the options in there, and I need to brainstorm those and decide, okay, would that resolve it? And then I need to imagine how it would be if I took that particular action. And then I'm going to say, okay, that I won't be successful that way. That's not going to help me feel any better. So I need to go back to the drawing board. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that we need to identify, how will I know if I'm successful? How will I know that it's worked? So if I'm resolving this conflict, how am I going to know that it's resolved and not just swept underneath the carpet, that it's truly resolved? And then I'm going to actually do whichever one of those choices I made. And I think when we're making choices, there are things we need to do or we need. There are things we want, and there are things that would be nice to. But we at least need to take care of our needs. And maybe my need is to express myself. Then I'm going to use iMessages. But I'm going to go through this process because conflict resolution is a way to solve a problem. And so that's a process that you could go through. On another quick note, if it's a really simple problem and you don't have to, who's going to stand in front of the line? You can do things like paper, rock, scissors, right? So that it's immediately resolved. And so there are quick fixes for conflict that's kind of low level. But if it's a serious, in-depth feeling that you have and conflict, then you can use a problem-solving strategy. So Brett, I'll bump that back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered most everything. I just will come at it from more of just if it's you and one other person, because if it's just you, it's easier to identify because there's not both people. Because if what I say it was a blue shirt on Monday and you say it was a green giraffe on Tuesday, that could be conflict right from the jump. So I think it's really, having some common ground. And what I say is consensus, not compromise. So, and I think I actually got that from you, Gmal, where consensus says that we're both in agreement and we feel great about it. And then compromise is both of us, we're getting what we don't want. And so we don't ever want to be able to do that. And so I think that the process is a little bit longer, obviously, if there's two or more people involved. And I think that it's a little bit more difficult because the fact of the matter, we've all come from different backgrounds. I know it wasn't my wife, but it was somebody else. She would, do a little trash talking to some people that maybe weren't wearing shoes in the mall. And I would say, well, we don't know their background. They could be from the outback where they don't have shoes or they don't wear shoes anywhere or whatever. Right. And so we shouldn't say anything about that or even think these thoughts. Yes, of course we can have opinions, but the judgment behind it, where it's right or wrong, maybe is not so great. And so you have all these dynamics that are happening when you have this peer-to-peer conflict and how to be able to resolve it. But I like the way that you went through those where, you're going to identify the problem, you're going to explore solutions or brainstorm solutions. Then you guys agree on the solution. Then you go out and take action and implement. And then you may have to go back and revisit because whatever you brainstormed from the beginning may not have, you may still have the conflict and it's not resolved. And that's okay too. You may have to go through the cycle a few times.
Absolutely. And I would love to claim that notion about compromise, but I will tell you in truth, that was Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of England, who I happened to have the opportunity to hear. And I'd never thought about it that way. That compromise is when both people lose. And then she also said, people have an infinite capacity to wait to get even. And and she was speaking from a world viewpoint, point. But I think that that's true with all of us, right? So if you don't go back and, like you said, resolve the conflict at the end till you really resolved it, people do have an infinite capacity to wait to get even, and that is not pleasant for sure. Okay, Robert, what's next?
Yes, our next question is how can I teach youth to identify the root cause of conflicts?
So, Brett, do you want to go with that first, or do you
Yeah, I
want me?
mean, right, because to me this is the big thing, and so we've done this whole curriculum over 100 hours, and part of that is sure self-awareness. You need to understand what your buttons are, right? Because my buttons would be different than your buttons. And I remember way back in the day when I was very young, I was doing daycare, and I think I was 18 years old, and there was a guy that was like mad dogging me as I'm getting out of the car. And so I hadn't officially started my capacity as a daycare worker, but I was like, is there a problem? Like, like what's the problem here? So we kind of had some words back and forth about it. And I remember talking to you about it. And you said, well, who do you think you were having the conflict with? I go, this, jerk off in the middle of the parking lot. You said, I don't think so. And then you mentioned the name of the person that it was probably that I was having the conflict with. And I was like, oh my goodness. So a lot of times what we bring to the table is this baggage that if somebody says something very innocent in their mind, we're all riled up and mad and upset, and then this conflict goes there. So I think to get to the root of the problem, we have to have this what we call sure self-awareness. You have to be aware of what's going to trigger you. I had another guy one time. He was a teacher buddy of mine, and he was married to a black woman, and there was a person that was trash talking him like he was racist or prejudiced, and he never said a word. And I said, why wouldn't you say, well, if you think I'm all those things, you might want to tell my wife of 22 years as well, that because she may not know that I'm that. And he looked at me. He goes, yeah, I just don't play around with ignorance. And I thought, wow, what a great what great wisdom and understanding that he had. And so that wasn't a trigger to him. But then I also saw the same guy where this guy in the teachers lounge was yapping at him, and he's like, hey, like I've had enough. And this guy was very mild mannered, very chilled, and he said, I've had enough. And so I basically had to grab him in the lounge because he would go after this guy. So what are your triggers? What are your hot buttons? And we all have them. And I'm not tattling on my mom. She can. It's her own story to tell. But her trigger is mouse, not mice, but the mouse on the computer. It triggers her from time to time. It doesn't work. So as long as we understand and we know what's going on in our head, and then if we mess it up, it's okay. Reflect on it. What would I do differently? You can always replay it and say, I'm going to do this differently next time. And so, but it's easy to be conflicted and with somebody else, and they're not even really in it to begin with. It's just between you and you.
For sure, for sure. Another thing I think, and I'm going to use this as a parallel. You know how you can catch a cold? You can have a cold, and you have runny eyes, a sore throat, chest congestion, a cough, maybe your ear aches, whatever. Those are all symptoms. The root cause is that you have a cold, you have a virus. But I think that that's true with conflict as well. You can identify all the symptoms. The symptom is that I'm upset. The symptom is this. The symptom is that. And you can solve for that symptom, but you're not solving the conflict. That's like if you go to the doctor and you say to him, "Oh, doctor, I don't feel good. I have this sore throat, my chest aches, my ears hurt, blah, blah, blah." And they say, "Here, I'll give you eye drops." Not so much, right? All it's doing is fixing your watering eyes. It's not fixing your cold. And so I think when it comes to conflict, that's a great parallel, because if you try and fix a symptom, there is no cure in that. The symptom, it will manifest again and again and again and again until you get to the root of it. And that's why it's so important, I think, to give kids touch points so they can understand the difference between a symptom and a root cause, because it's the root cause that you need to address. Now, in the process of doing that, you might address the symptoms too, but your goal is to address that root cause so that you can be clear about what it is you're trying to fix or to solve. So that's what I would say about.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I know when I would talk with youth about it, with conflict, I would talk about the weed, right? You can hula hoe the topsoil and get that weed. That sucker grows back the next day, right? But if we go down and get the root, it may take a year for it to grow back, or maybe never.
Absolutely. And I think that there's no quick fix. If it's truly a deep-seated conflict that you need to know yourself more about, there is no quick fix. You're gonna have to work at that. And I think that otherwise, if it's a simple one, teach them rock, paper, scissors, and they can resolve it themselves. Okay, Robert, let's move on.
Yes, I have a question from the chat. I don't know the name of it, but it says, how can effective communication skills like active listening and using I statements help resolve conflicts in a positive way?
Well, if you begin by listening and not listening, so Western culture, which is what we're all a part of, uh, doesn't really consider communication very well, in my opinion. What we do is we debate. If we debate, it's I'm right, you're wrong, you need to be quiet and listen to me and do it my way. Or we might say, "Oh, that's very harsh. I don't do that. I'm willing to discuss." Okay, great. So I'm going to listen to you so that I can tell you why I'm right and you're wrong, and you ought to do it my way. That's a discussion. A dialogue is when you say, "This is what's going on in me. Please tell me what's going on in you so that I can understand." So when you listen actively, you're not listening to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong. You're not listening to figure out what you're going to say back. What you're listening for is to understand and to say, "Oh, I don't necessarily agree with that, maybe, but I understand it. I'm going to try and stand in their shoes, and I'm going to try and see it from their point of view." When we're in conflict, communication allows you to get as close as possible to the other person without compromising who you are. This isn't about compromising yourself, but it is about going, "Okay, I don't agree with that, but I can see how they could see it that way. Let's see if we can find common ground." So I think that that's why active listening is so important, because you're listening. And if you can see the person, you're also reading body language, which will tell you far more than the words. You're watching facial expressions. You're also hearing tone. It always amazed me when I would have people say, "So and so yelled at me." And I said, "Oh, really? When did that happen?" "Via email." "Well, how do you know they were yelling at you?" You read that into that. Or maybe their words sort of told you that, but you don't know. So you're going to read all that. And then the reason iMessages work is that you are taking ownership of what you are thinking and you are feeling. and then inviting others to share with you. So that's how I would answer that, and why I think it's so important that you have that skill set and that you work on it. And you can work on it all the time. And I don't care how old you are, you can resort to 3-year-old temper tantrum in a nanosecond, right? You can get crossed and it's like, "Rrr," and then you have to pull yourself down. You have to know yourself, and you have to then monitor yourself. So I'll leave it at that. Brett, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just everything that they had asked and everything that you had talked about is prevention versus intervention. Because what we want to do is try to prevent the conflict from happening. So I know this wasn't part of the actual question, but if we know ourselves well, we know what those hot buttons are going to be. If we know all of these things, we understand that it's not personal, it's personality and all of these things. And then you add in all the different things as part of the question that they asked and what you had replied upon. Now we're just in a much better spot to be able to prevent these things from happening, because the reality is this: their perception is their reality, but that doesn't make it real. Your perception is your reality, and that doesn't make it real either. Because usually, as you know, when if you think about when the kids would come from recess and tattle, right? This is what happened, and this is what happened. And it's like the telephone game. It's probably somewhere in the middle. It probably wasn't a white giraffe, and it probably wasn't a blue gorilla, but maybe it was a red ant that started this conflict to begin with. The other thing I'll end on is the communication cycle, right? And so I think we've talked about this in the past, where act like I have two stick figures, and it starts with their heart, and then it goes up, and they have their brain, and then they have a mouth and their ears, and they're speaking, and they're facing the other person, and then it goes to them, and they have their brain and their heart and all those things, their ears. And so we always say, well, when you communicate with somebody, where does it go? And everybody, the trick question says, oh, it goes to the other person's ears. And it's like, no, it goes to their circumstances first. Now, technically that's through their ears, and we've talked about that before. Oh, Gma, I'm going to have this great luau. Man, it's going to be so much fun, and we're going to do this and that. We're going to roast pig. Well, if you're a vegetarian or you're kosher, roasting pig isn't good for you. So I'm thinking like, oh, this is great, and there's not going to be any conflict here. Everything's wonderful and perfect, because that's my perception. But the reality is that your perception is that you're kosher or vegan or vegetarian, and you don't eat that. So how will you navigate that potential conflict in your life, so to speak? But again, thank you so much for the question. Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. All right, Robert, anything else in the chat? Did we lose him?
Oh no, I'm sorry, I was on mute. They said
You
thank
were
you.
talking to yourself, huh?
Yes, I was. The next question is, what role does empathy play in resolving disputes?
You know, empathy to me is understanding another person, being able to stand in their shoes, but not trying to fix them. And I think that's very hard. So I can be indifferent to you. And quite frankly, I don't care, right? That's this low end of the continuum. I'm just totally indifferent. And then I can do cursory things that are pretend that I care. Oh, I'm sorry, right? Or I can be sympathetic and I can go, oh, wow, I don't know how you're coping and all of that. Or I can move that to being empathetic, which means I'm going to sit with you while you are exploring how you feel, how you're interpreting things, but I'm not going to try and fix you. I'm going to listen, and I may offer something up. I might say, I wonder what, right? But I'm not trying to come in and rescue you from your feelings. And to me, empathy requires practice. And when we work with kids, I think we very often try and resolve it for them. I want to fix it for you. And the fact of the matter is, when you fix conflict for kids and you don't help them work through that process and develop empathy and an understanding that someone else's reality is as real to them as yours is to you, then I think we do them a real disservice, because you're not going to be with them for 24/7 the rest of their life. They have to be able to go, okay, this is what I see. Let me see if I can figure out how it would look from their point of view. And then that's empathy. I get how you feel, and I'm going to stay with you, but I'm not going to try and fix you or I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to fix you to my agenda. I'm just going to embrace that. So I'll push that back to you, Brett.
Yeah, so I have what I call Captain Caption. And so what I do is I just walk around and I try to look at other people's caption. So when I pull into the stall, when I'm driving, and let's say I'm a little bit, on the line almost to the right, but I always get out and I check, because I don't know the car next to me, but what about if it was a pregnant mom and I gave her this much space when I should have given her more space because I didn't park correctly? So I'm always trying to look at everybody else's caption. Another way to say that is what I call the wonderful WIIFM, which stands for what's in it for me, or in this case, what's in it for them. And so I try to tune into the FM dial, WIIFM, and then you underline and bold it. I want to tune into the FM dial of their radio station. And so I think that is empathy, right? You're trying to really, like you said, be in their shoes. But that's how I walk around all the time. Now, I don't always maybe make the right moves, but I'm always very aware of what's probably going on in the other person's head. And then on top of that, I can always ask them to confirm that, or maybe it's denied, because remember, my perception is my reality, but it doesn't mean that it's real, right? I think that the other thing is that empathy is like one of those best tricks of the trade, or what I call peak practices or best practices. I look at it and say, when we're dealing with youth or adults with conflict, it doesn't matter. Conflict is conflict. I'm saying, hey, if I'm the archer, how many different arrows do I have? Because if the first arrow doesn't hit the mark based off of a best practice that I have or a trade trick, then do I have a second, a third, a fourth, or a fifth? But to me, empathy is the number one go-to every single time. And if that doesn't work for whatever reason, then I will have other tools in my toolbox, or arrows in my quiver, so to speak. And I think those are big deals. The other thing is this: if we're reacting out of emotion to something, right, then obviously we're not being very empathetic. We're reacting out of emotion because the only thing we're empathetic about is our own needs, our own wants, our own whatevers, right? And so if we respond from intellect based off of this empathy umbrella, I think that that's very helpful to be able to say, here's the how we're going to resolve this dispute, right? That's the bottom line, so to speak. This is how we'll do that, by me taking the first step towards you. I always think about the Wizard of Oz, follow the yellow brick road. Well, it's my job to put the first brick out there, to take the first step towards Resolute, so to speak. So that's what I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Empathy to me is just really important. I agree with you 100%. So, Robert, we have a follow-up.
Yes, our next question is, how can I use role playing to practice conflict resolution?
Role play, if you can, sometimes kids will get goofy when you do role play. So you kind of have to set the stage for that. Role play is when you're going to take different parts. And sometimes maybe you'll do the role play with the students so that you can model that, so then the kids can go out and do it themselves. I find that when you say to them, role model, pretend, blah, blah, that's kind of hard for them to do sometimes. But if you model it with one of them and say, okay, this is the situation, this is this is what occurred, and then you can have discussion with that person. How might you feel about that? How might you, what would might be going on for you? And let me talk about what's going on for me, so that you kind of can set that stage. Then they may be able to actually role play it and do it as a conversation that's going back and forth. This, oh, when this happened, this is how I feel. And so maybe you've practiced iMessages and you want them to have that opportunity to practice going through that pattern, right? That full scope of iMessages. But I think that you can't just say, ready, set, role play. I think that they have to understand and go through the steps. And it may take you 5 or 6 tries at role playing before what you hear them doing is acting out the conflict that they've identified. So what it does is it gives you practice, and it gives you practice. So there's pretend practice when you can do it with an adult who's probably not going to be quite as rough on you as your peer, right? You can play that back and forth, and then you can have that with your peer, but that's still not real world, right? It's practicing for the real world because you're role playing. You're not in the middle of a conflict, and I think that that's helpful so that kids get the idea of the back and forth and how it works through. So I think that role play is helpful, but I don't think you just say ready, set, go. I think you have to work that through with them so that they know how to role play.
Yeah, and I think, so setting up the scenario or the simulation in something that's real to them is very important. So if you do this obscure thing out here in left field, it doesn't really, help. But if there was a dispute over, who was going to bring the balls in or something, then you guys can set that up as a real life scenario. So that's the first thing. The second thing is start easy, right? Let's go real easy. And so then we can move to medium, and then we can move to something more difficult. And so you can talk with kids and or adults about that. The other thing is I like to chunk it. So I try to break everything down into like holistic instruction. There's an opening, there's a middle piece, usually the content, and then there's a closing. And so if you break it down in chunks like that, as they say, mile by mile takes a while, but whatever the opposite of that is, I forget the saying, but inch by inch is a cinch, right?
Right.
So that's what we're trying to be able to set up. So if we do it in a real life situation, we go something real easy, but it has to be in real life. And then we chunk those things and break it down into twos or threes, so to speak. Even if they're older, middle school or high school, at first, that's not a bad plan. That's the whole gradual release of responsibility. And then the other part of it is too, is understanding the difference between role modeling and role playing. And so we need to be role modeling this to the youth all the time. And we go back to, would you rather hear or see a walking sermon or a talking sermon? Well, everybody wants to see the walking sermon so that we're role modeling these behaviors along the way, and they can see that whether it's adult and kid, whether it's adult with adult, because they're watching, right? They're looking all the time. It's like what I say when I walk in a room, I'm reading the room. Well, they're reading you all the time, and so you could get the yap all you want, but if you're showing something different, then they're going to call you on that.
And if they don't call you, they will imitate you, right? And they're just going to do what you do. And that is the blessing and the curse of being a role model, right? The blessing is when you do it right, for sure. All right, thanks. How about another question, Robert?
Yes, this is from the chat, and the question is, what are some healthy ways to cool down when you're feeling angry or upset during a conflict?
So, we say these things to kids all the time. Take a deep breath. Take 10 deep breaths. Walk away for a moment. Come back. Collect yourself. Right? Count to 10. So one of the things that I think is important is sometimes discounting to 10 is not enough. So what you want to help kids put together is a calm down routine that works for them. And in that calm down routine, maybe they're going to do 5 deep breaths, followed by counting backwards from 10, followed by thinking of the last time you felt really good about yourself, right? Whatever that calm down routine is. Because if they can practice that and they get better at it, it doesn't have to be as obvious as it is in the beginning, but you will go through that process. I do want to share that it's been about a month now. I was out visiting at a site, and the person, the adult, was bringing 20 kids back in from playing a sport. And I don't know what happened out there because I didn't go out there to see it. But on their way back, there was one child who was so upset. I can't believe it. They were doing this and just going on and on. And so the leader lined the kids up at the door, and then he walked over with this young man and gave him some space away from everybody. And he said to him, I know that you are very upset. What I'd like for you to do now is to go through your calm down routine so that you can rejoin us. And later I found out that this young man, this boy, he gets angry very quickly. And so they've taught him this routine. And while he's going through this routine, you can see him physically calming down. And so he said, okay, fine. Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to replay what happened. I'm going to replay it. I'm going to replay it. What did I do? What did I do? What, right? And so that was step one, to replay it in his mind. And then reflect. Okay, I need to reflect. Could I have done something else? Right? And he's going through, and then he said, okay, I need to count to 10. 1, 2. And he went through this whole process, and it took him about 5 minutes. But in the end, he had calmed down so that he could talk about the conflict, because he was so upset he couldn't even talk about it. So I just think that teaching kids calm down routines, breathing in. Have you ever done four count breathing? That in and of itself is very challenging, and it puts you in the moment right here, right now, where you inhale to the count of 4, and you have to keep inhaling till you get to 4, and then you hold for 4, then you exhale for 4 all the way through, and then you hold for 4. So if you don't want them to just take deep breaths, you can teach them four corner counting of breathing. So there are things you can do, but they need to be able to run a calm down routine that works for them.
Can you repeat the question? Because I heard that a little differently. I thought that was about the adult, but can you repeat that, Robert?
Yes. So the question was, what are some healthy ways to cool down when you are feeling angry or upset during a conflict?
Okay, and so it wasn't adult or a kid. It was just
Right.
overall asked. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. So I mean, either way, it didn't matter to me, because to me how to solve that is the same, right? It doesn't matter, having a calm down routine, whether you're an adult or a kid. Either direction, it works out to where you should have that. My big thing on this is get it out. Just don't get it out right then, right? And so if you're riled up about something, you need to get that poison out of you. But that doesn't mean that you can't hold it in for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, until you get your next break, until dot, 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 right? If you just have to get it out right then because you're going to explode, go write it down, right? Go to a journal and just write it down, and everything that you want to say. And that's the second part of it is I say, just because you're getting it out doesn't mean you have to get it out on the person that you're upset with, right? So you need to get the poison out of you, but that doesn't mean that they have to be involved with it. And I think a lot of times we think, oh, I have to go tell them. Maybe, but maybe not. And here's the other thing. How many of you have really stayed really mad and you're just up there for more than 2 hours or more than 3 hours or more than 5 hours? Not many people can do that unless you're, I'm watching I think it's Paramount or Netflix or whatever, SEAL team. Now those guys are, they have some emotions that are way up all the time because it's a life or death situation. But most of the time when we're dealing with stuff, it's typically not going to be a life or death situation. So I always say, give it 30 minutes. If you're still mad, maybe double it and give yourself another 30 minutes. And at the end of that hour, usually it's like, I don't even remember what I was upset to begin with, but I don't know why I was up at this high level. Or again, if you need to get it out, write it down. If you need to get it out, go, and you can. I have to go to the restroom now and go let them have it in the restroom. They just happen to not be in the restroom, right? Because you need to be able to get that out, so to speak. So thanks for the question, and hopefully that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Okay, next one.
Yes, our next question is what strategies promote active listening in conflict situations?
You want me to
I
go?
think, yeah. Oh, did you want to go first?
Oh no, I just didn't know if you wanted me.
Okay, no, either way. Uh, I think that you have to practice listening when you're not in conflict, right? If the only time you try to listen actively is when you're in disagreement, that you're dealing with another whole set of emotions, right, as well. But I think that you can practice active listening, and you can do that in a variety of ways. And one of my favorites is called inside outside circles. And what you do is you form two circles. So let's say there are 20 people, and you put 10 on the inside and you put 10 on the outside, and they face each other. So the people in the center have their backs to each other, and then the people on the outside are looking at them. And you have them talk about a topic. And then you ask them, how did you know that that person was listening to you? What behaviors did they exhibit that told you they were listening to you? And they'll say things like, well, they made eye contact with me. They nodded. They smiled. They asked a question that was pertinent to what I had said, right? There are all these ways that you know that the person's listening to you. And then I like to turn it the other direction. How do you know that the person was telling you their truth? Not the truth, but their truth. How did you know? What did they do? They gestured, they made points, right? They will do that. So if you're doing that and teaching kids how to have that communication so that they can start to look for certain behaviors that they should exhibit if they are actively listening, I think that if you practice those before you get into conflict, then when their conflict occurs, and maybe you're debriefing it afterwards, you can say, did you practice those skills of active listening? Remember, we've practiced those before. Did you practice them this time? So I think that it's practicing that before you need it in a conflict situation, and then remind yourself to hold the stop sign up and say, do not go here. Let's prevent, and I'm going to practice the strategies I learned in active listening.
Yeah, so I would say that there's the micro, right? And so it could be a head nod, it could be raising the eyebrows, it could be smiling, it could be shaking your head, it could be, like wow, that really make sense, whatever, with all the body language, like give me more type stuff. So I think there's all the micro stuff. To me, one of the big ones is you raise your eyebrows, like wow, I'm really understanding, I'm really engaged. So I think the micro is important. I think the second part is what I would call mirroring. And so I'm a body language guy, and I've taken some several courses on this. And so you can mirror what they're doing as well. So if they're here, kind of with their index finger pointing at their eye or up there, you can do that as well. Now you don't want to overdo that. Yeah, exactly. Because if you're doing every movement, they sneeze, you sneeze, but you can do subtle things like that. I remember when I first learned it, I thought this is not true, right? And so I happened to be getting gas, and the guy had his hand up against his car and had his legs crossed. So I just did it to mirror him. And I go, "How you doing?" "Oh man," he told me his whole life story. So I was like, "Well, I guess that stuff works." So I think there's the micros, and then I think there's more, the bigger picture of being able to do the mirroring. The other thing is parroting, right? So that you say, "Oh, I believe this is what you're saying," or you could just repeat back, "Oh, the red shirt on Wednesday," so that they understand that you're doing it. So there's all the nonverbals, and then you have the verbals of parenting as well. But watch avoiding the interruptions. You don't want to over parrot, just like you don't want to overdo the things you're doing, as mirroring or whatever the case may be as well. The other thing too is that, I like to ask them, "Are you done? Have you said everything you wanted to say?" So that way I know, and then I could go and, I can talk with them. And then to me, if you want to really learn how to do this the best, go on the shorts on YouTube and watch reaction videos, because you'll see everything that we're talking about. You'll go, like where they jump back, like, or "Oh my gosh," they'll lean forward, or they're like, "Oh wow," or they'll even stop, whatever, like say it's a music reaction video. They'll stop it and they'll go, "Whoa, that girl can sing," or whatever the case may be, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of ways to be able to really active listen. There's a lot of skills in that.
For sure, for sure. So, Robert, do we have one more quick question
Yes, we
that
still
we
have.
can try and answer in 3 minutes?
Yes, we still have time for one more question. So our next question is gonna be: how can I foster a culture of respect to prevent conflicts?
You know,
You want me to go real
this,
fast? And then
yeah, yes, please do.
yeah, so I mean, set clear expectations, right? And what does that look like? Because I'm not a big fan of that word respect, because what does it look like? So in my house, it was a very competitive house. Like we would get into it over Monopoly because we were just super competitive. Sports was a big deal, other than on my mom's side, but the boys and all that stuff. And so, when you say respect, you have to define that out, set clear expectations, and be able to model what that looks like. Because remember, in my house, I was cool with whatever. Boards would be flying with Monopoly with my brothers and stuff because we were both so competitive. Now, at my wife's house, that would have been like, "Oh my gosh, you guys are nuts." But to me, we weren't mad or upset at anybody. We just wanted to win the game so bad. So I think it's, recognizing that and setting very clear expectations of ultimately what does that culture or that specific word respect really look like in me.
I would agree. And I think it's also, what does it sound like? Right? What will it look like? What's the demonstrable behavior? What might you hear somebody say? What might you see somebody do? And if you flesh that out, you will discover that respect starts growing because everybody's on the same page. They're rowing in the same direction. They all agree that this is what respect looks like. And I just want to end by saying you need to respect yourself, you need to respect others, and you need to respect property. And all three of those are important when we look at respect. So I want to be sure that we're respecting your time. And thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the questions. We appreciate your paying attention to this topic because it truly is something that we all deal with all of the time. So thank you for joining us. We hope that you join us next week. We'll be sending out information